All right, hello guys. I am back doing another tier list, this time for leg exercises. So I'm going to rank them all. I'm going to talk about pros and cons of each exercise and why you might want to do each one or why you might not want to. I tried to choose some of the most common exercises, and I did kind of limit it to hip and quad and hamstring. Right, I didn't really talk about calves so much, just because there's already so many different exercises. But let's get into it. We're starting off with the back squat. Okay, and this is it's often regarded as the king of all leg exercises. I think there's a good reason for that. You can load it up super heavy. It's a compound movement. You get the hips, the quads, and the back. Really great for general strength development. I am going to put it in the A tier, however, not the S tier, because while I do think it's a very good kind of general exercise, I don't think it's really the best for any unique objective. So I'm going to leave that in the A tier. Let's talk about then the front squat. And I don't think these are super common, but comparing it directly to the back squat, one, there's going to be a lot of people are going to find there's a lot more tension in the quads. I do think they become a more commonly useful objective for targeting the quads in that sense than the back squat. Also, and the reason I'm going to put it in the S tier primarily is because the engagement you get from your thoracic spine and your core, especially if you hold it in a proper Olympic front rack on your shoulders, is absolutely incredible. Also, on top of that, having the body in a more vertical position and having to kind of tighten up more centered over the feet, I think is a lot more representative of athletic movements. So I generally think the front squat is a more athletic movement and slightly better at targeting the quads. I love front squats, so I'll put them in the S tier for that. Next up, I included the power clean. These aren't super common, but when you see someone doing power cleans, it's usually an actual athlete or some just massive. I see a lot of Polynesian guys at my gym doing these, and they always have just incredible legs. You never see someone who's good at power cleans and doesn't have just monstrous legs. All of these movements are going to be kind of some combination of hip extension and knee extension. The power clean is no exception to that. And while you're going to handle typically slightly lower loads, you're handling them at much greater speeds, and I think that explosive power is a really useful thing to include in your training. So I'm going to put the power clean in the S tier as well. Moving on then to the deadlift, the other exercise that's sometimes regarded as the king of all leg exercises. I don't know if I'd say it's king over the for legs in general, but I'm going to put deadlift in the S tier as well. Why? Because when we're bending over like that, your glutes are in a stretched position, right? More so than just about any other exercise. You're going to be starting from almost full hip flexion. So your glutes are stretched out. And then, of course, the deadlift, I would argue, generally is loaded heavier than any other exercise. So you get just this incredible tension in the glutes in a stretched position. I think this is the gold standard for glute development in particular. But it's also all right for your back and your quads too. So I'm going to leave that in the S tier. Then a deadlift, two deadlift variations, the Romanian deadlift. Some people will argue about, if you're supposed to have your hips in a certain position or something for it to be called a Romanian deadlift. I just classify a Romanian deadlift as a deadlift where it doesn't touch the ground, okay? So you unrack it and you're holding it the whole time. Comparing that to the deadlift, a lot of people are going to end up handling lighter loads. I actually handle pretty similar loads on a Romanian deadlift and a deadlift, but it can be a little more fatiguing for that reason. I think most people aren't going to get the same weights they will with the deadlift. But if you could make an argument that there's more time under tension because you're not dropping the load. I don't think that's going to make a significant difference for hypertrophy, but I still think this is a very, very solid option. So I'm going to leave it in the A tier. I'm not going to put it in the S tier like a deadlift because most people, again, aren't going to be getting quite the same loads. And I think that tension and strength is what's mostly going to drive development. And then a stiff leg deadlift. So this is one very clearly. Your knees are going to be, usually not full extension, but close to full extension. You're restricting movement to mostly the hip joint, to mostly to hip extension, and then with your knee more extended as well. Your hamstrings, right? Your semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and the long head of your biceps femoris, in particular, they're going to be stretched, right? And they're going to be taking on a little bit more of the load. I think this is a really wonderful option for getting probably more tension in the hamstrings that way than in any other exercise. I think it's very similar to the quality of the deadlift, except you're shifting that emphasis to the hamstrings instead. I don't think I'm gonna put it in the S tier, but I will put it in the A tier. I think it's a wonderful option for the hamstrings. All right, next up is leg press. And this is where a lot of you all might start to not like me. But I want to point out something about the leg press. Look, when you are at the top of a leg press, right, before you start the movement, your hips are already in about 80 degrees of flexion. And that's my biggest problem with this exercise. Because normal range of motion for hip flexion is restricted to about 125 degrees usually. And there's just nowhere to go, right? So people who are bringing their knees, all the way up to their chest, that's not coming from just your hips. If you go past a certain point, that's coming from your low back as well, and that's what a lot of people are doing. But if you do restrict movement to your hips, there's just so little range of motion available because of the way the machine is built. I do think it's okay because that stretch position is a great way to initiate hypertrophy in the glutes. But also for the legs, there's going to be restricted range of motion at the knee as well because your hips can only go so far. Even if you put your feet as low down on the platform as you can, I just think there's so little range of motion, and I think there are better ways to load them as well. I'm going to put the leg press in, I'm going to put it in the D tier. I think no matter what you're doing, I think there's so much better options. The hack squat is another machine, and I think this kind of I think the hack squat for the quads is what the deadlift is for the glutes. So I'm definitely going to put this one in the S tier. I think it's a squat variation, but with the feet being positioned more anterior to the torso, it puts a lot of emphasis on the quads. I wish a lot of these machines allowed for a slightly greater range of motion, but it's certainly significant, and I don't think there's a better way to maximize tension in the quads than the hack squat. Wonderful option for developing hypertrophy, for developing muscle size as well as strength. Pendulum squat. This is one a little less common, but I've loved this one. I've done this one a lot. The reason I like this one in particular is because you can get a full range of motion at the quads. There's not a whole lot of options, certainly not a whole lot of common options that allow you to do that. I do think loading is really limited, and I think it takes a lot of time to build up to reasonable working loads in a full range of motion because most people just aren't prepared for that. But I think including some type of full range of motion knee movement is a really big benefit to long-term progress. On its own, I don't think it's necessarily going to be it's not going to be the center of your program, but I definitely think it's a solid inclusion. I'm going to put it in the B tier. Leg extensions. Another one that you guys probably aren't going to like. I know everyone loves these, and it's really interesting, when you do a set of leg extensions to failure or beyond or whatever, the pain, right, the burn in your thighs is just absolutely excruciating. And I think a lot of people think, okay, well, I'm definitely going to be growing from that. But that's not necessarily the case. Usually that's, going to be some type of metabolic fatigue. But my really big issue with the leg extension is you are never, ever going to get as much mechanical tension in the quadricep muscle itself as you will with your feet on the ground in something like a hack squat or even a regular squat. That's the same whether you're doing high repetitions or low repetitions. Just because you can't lift the weight anymore, it doesn't necessarily mean your quad is getting loaded as much as we'd like it to. I do think they can be a somewhat useful inclusion for that metabolic fatigue that we can get. That's kind of fun. And for mind muscle connection, there's not a lot of opportunities for us to get much tension at all in full extension, but I think these are definitely overrated, and as mechanical tension is going to be the primary driver of growth, I don't think this is the best option. I'm honestly, yeah, I'm going to put it in the D tier as well. Okay, leg curls. The prone leg curl, and then we'll do the seated leg curl. So for the prone curl, the big difference between these two is, when you're in a seated position, you're in a position of hip flexion. So like in the deadlift or a stiff leg deadlift, with a seated hamstring curl, your semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and and the long head of your biceps femoris are in a more stretched position. So they're not as stretched in the prone curl. I think a lot of people look at that as a bad thing, but muscles are actually stronger in not at their maximum length, but at a slightly stretched position typically. So I find that comparing the prone hamstring curl to the seated hamstring curl, in the prone hamstring curl, I think a lot of people are going to be stronger. I'd say probably everyone should be, really. But also that stretch doesn't matter for the short head of the biceps femoris, which is the primary reason that I recommend including a knee flexion exercise in particular, to get that short head of the biceps femoris. But I think being able to handle bigger weights in the prone curl, these feel incredible. I'm going to leave these in the A tier. And then the seated curl, right? I kind of talked about some of those reasons, but I generally find these uncomfortable, right? If you are really going for that stretch, that might be a decent option, but I think it's a much less good option than a stiff leg deadlift if you want the stretch, right? A stiff leg deadlift is going to give you the stretch and much more tension. In the seated hamstring curls, I think they can certainly still be valuable, but I don't think you're going to be able to get the same levels of tension that you could in a prone hamstring curl, and certainly not as much as in a stiff leg deadlift. They can be kind of uncomfortable too, especially as you get to have heavier weights. It's kind of hard to hold yourself in position on the machine. So I'll put it in the B tier, but I think it's better for higher reps. I don't think it has the same growth potential that you can get from a prone curl. Okay, so let's see. Next step is going to be adduction and abduction. Starting with adduction, I think these are a little bit neglected. These are fairly massive muscles, right? Not as massive as the hamstrings or the quads, but they still contribute a lot to the size of your thighs. And also in a lot of hip extension movements, when the hip is in a flexed position, right? So the bottom of a squat or even in a deadlift potentially, the adductors have a opportunity to contribute to hip extension. So I think these are very important muscles, and I think this adduction machine is a really simple but effective way to get some extra volume in for them and stimulate hypertrophy. So I'm a big fan of those. I'll put those in the A tier. The abduction machine, okay, ABD, so pushing your hips out to the side. I think these are overrated. I see a lot of girls in particular, who want a big booty, sitting on this machine, doing all sorts of things on it. And so here's my big issue with that. Those muscles that you're targeting are so small compared to the glute maximus that I think it's just silly to chase, any kind of physical appearance through this machine in particular. The way your butt looks is going to come from, one, the size of your glute maximus, and two, how much body fat you have. Other than that, the smaller muscles that you're training with this abduction, they're not gonna, I know that's bad news for a lot of you, but that's not what's going to give your butt any kind of shape or size. Additionally, as someone who does mostly compound movements, every time I step on this machine, I can max it out, absolutely no problem. To me, that's a sign that I'm already training them. I think this might be useful as a corrective exercise for a lot of people, if there's a specific need to strengthen the abductors. But in general, I think this is not worth including in your program, and I'm going to put it in the D tier, unless you have a very specific reason to do so. Okay, that wraps up the machines. So the rest of these are going to be kind of, dumbbells or free weight kind of things. So let's start with the goblet squat. I think this is a really great option for people who are learning to squat, right? Holding the weight with your shoulders and your arms in front of you, it really reinforces keeping your spine in a straight position. It does have a serious loading capacity, right? You're never going to be able to, goblet squat 400 pounds. But I think especially for beginners and people learning to squat and, depending on your strength level, this is a really, really strong option. So I'm going to leave it in the B tier. Just because of its loading limitations, I won't put it higher. But if it's an appropriate exercise for you, it's a very good choice. The Bulgarian, actually no, first the sissy squat. So this is one, I guess there's kind of, not everyone does these the same, but my kind of definition of this is where you send your knees as far forward as you can and try to not engage your hips intentionally. So this is another one, kind of like the, where did I put it? The pendulum squat, where you can get quite a bit of tension in your quads at full range of motion. And, I think that's an important inclusion for optimizing hypertrophy. These can be, a little bit dangerous if you haven't done these before, right? I wouldn't recommend people loading their knees in full flexion, because most people just haven't done it since they were, a 2-year-old kid, and I don't want you to hurt yourself. But building up to these logically and reasonably, I think these are, a great thing to include, or at least be capable of doing, right? To have some baseline strength in that end range of motion. I'll put those in the B tier. I like to include them kind of intermittently, take them in and take them out of my programs every once in a while. And then the Bulgarian split squat. I think these really take it out of me, right? And I've heard people kind of, joke about this as well. There's just something about these that are remarkably fatiguing. I do think that it's really great to include unilateral training, right? Because you're basically doing a one-legged squat while stretching out your back leg and using it to balance at the same time, which I think is great. And you can get a lot of tension in that leg. I do think it's a really good strength training option, but I tend to prefer other exercises just because I think the stimulus that you get from it is not quite worth the fatigue that they might cause. Maybe, if you're in really good shape, I definitely think they're worth including, so I'll leave them in the B tier. But particularly when we're talking about just growing massive honking legs, I don't think they're going to be the most efficient option. I do think they're certainly a good choice, though, if not as good as some others. The step up. This is in a lot of ways it's similar to a Bulgarian split squat, right? We have all of these, hip extension and knee extension. Both of these are one leg. I like the step-ups a little better, though. I find they're, less fatiguing and you can be a little more explosive. But I think for a lot of the same reasons, you can load them up fairly heavily. I think it's great to include unilateral training, to some degree. I'll leave them in the B tier as well. And the hip thrust, aka Humpy Dumpies. We don't have a lot of opportunities to train the glutes at full hip extension. And this is, from a mechanical perspective, it's the perfect recipe for loading the glutes at full hip extension. I think this is a really great thing to include. I think they're overrated or underrated. A lot of, probably not by females, right? This is kind of, one of those exercises you see a lot of girls doing. But I think there's a good reason for it. I think this is a phenomenal way to train the glutes, and especially if you're an athlete, if you're like a jumper or a runner, where some strength in that end range of motion might benefit you. I think it's a great inclusion. I will note on these, a lot of people go really, really, really heavy. They're kind of hoisting it from the bottom, right? If your goal is to train, high levels of tension in a more stretched position, just do a deadlift. Okay, I think the real value of this exercise is being able to really contract and hold that end range of extension. So my advice is to lighten up the loads and get that end range contraction under control. But I think that's great. Nordic hamstring curls. These are, I wish that everybody was doing these. I didn't do them for a long time, but when I started doing them, it was like night and day. These just feel absolutely incredible. You know, they're gonna hit your hamstrings like, you know, in a way you've probably never felt before. Um, they're, yeah, the predominant movement. Some people will talk about your glutes and your low back. I think that's silly. Right, the idea is to, you know, keep everything straight except for your knees, right? So this is definitely a knee flexion exercise, but so you're getting that, you know, kind of hamstring curl benefit of the short head of the biceps femoris where we're isolating knee flexion, but it's definitely going to include the other three muscles of the hamstrings as well. Loads of tension. You know, you can get a massive eccentric contraction here. I'm going to put these in the S tier. I love these. I've seen a lot of benefits since including them, and I like to get as many people doing them as I can. The next up, let's see. Okay, we're on the sit-up, and you might be wondering why is that in here? Isn't that an ab exercise? No, there is, you know, some spine flexion occurring, right, particularly at the beginning of the movement, but the movement is predominantly hip flexion. And so where that's going to come from is in large part the rectus femoris, right, one of your four quadricep muscles, and the rectus femoris, it crosses the knee joint as well as the hip joint. So if you do, you know, as many of these as you can, you will start to feel that burn straight up and down your quad. So this is a great quad exercise, right? I'm saying that with regards to the rectus femoris that crosses the hip. It's not going to hit all of the quads, but I do think this is a really great way to target that muscle in particular. It feels fantastic, and I think if you're doing a lot of, you know, especially if you're doing a lot of hip flexion or hip extension movements like squats and deadlifts, I think it's really good to kind of balance that out with some hip flexion. So give these a try if you haven't. I love to actually, I always kind of superset my Nordic hamstring curls at my sit-ups. That's really convenient, and both are not fatiguing, so I can kind of knock them out back to back. But I'm going to put these in the A tier. It might, yeah, I know it's thought of as an ab exercise, but give it a shot. I think you'll probably like it. I've really come to like them a lot myself. Okay, and then we'll finish it off with four kind of lunge movement patterns. These all have similarities, of course, right? They're all lunges, but the forward lunge, right? So in the forward lunge, you get an eccentric on the front quad, and then the concentric is from the front quad as well. So I think this is a better option for the quads, but my problem with it is, you know, you kind of kick off, you know, explosively with when you step back, and then you're just kind of floating back for a second, then you have to step back in. I feel like I'm wasting a lot of time when I do these exercises. So I do think this is a little more quad targeted variation of the lunge, but I personally don't I don't love these for that reason. I think the time under tension is just too low for them to be really effective for stimulating hypertrophy. The next lunge is going to be the reverse lunge. So this is going to be almost exactly the opposite. The eccentric is going to be more in the front hip, right, the glute, and then the concentric is going to be more in that front hip, the glute as well. These you can load up pretty well, and I like these better. It basically becomes like a one-legged squat, right, where you're lowering yourself under control and just stepping one leg back. But you can load these up. I think this is a more glute-oriented lunge variation, and I think that's certainly valuable. I'll put it in the B tier. The walking lunge, right? So that's where you get kind of the mix of both of those. You get the so you have the eccentric when you step forward with your front quad mostly, and then when you step forward and up, you're getting the concentric from your front glute mostly. So I think this is a nice balance. You can load these pretty heavily, but I don't know. I think when people load these really heavily, they get kind of choppy, and I think they become less valuable in that way. I think these are better done with lighter weights and for kind of a, you know, sort of chasing that metabolic stimulus. And so, you know, I think they're okay. I don't think they have any particular, unique value to them. I'll leave them in the B tier. And then the last sort of, this isn't really a lunge, but it's still the lunge pattern where we're stepping forward and backward with our legs. This is my favorite of all of the sort of lunge, leg split patterns, because one, since you're getting up in the air and you're coming down faster, you're going to get a much more forceful eccentric, and you're creating we're going for power, right, in the concentric as well, right? We can load these fairly heavily, but we're also introducing a speed component. Also, with your body staying more centralized around one point, your back leg and your front leg are going to both be contributing to kind of pushing up together against each other, and I think you get a lot more involvement out of both quads, whether they're forward or backward. So this is very quad centric, if you will, and I think you can get the most tension by far out of any kind of lunge pattern from this one. So I'm going to put this one in the A tier. I like to do those a lot. All right, and there you have it. Yeah, just like with the chest and just like with the back, if you want to know what my program is, you can look at the S tier right there. That's what I do. So focus on those. If you have any questions, or if I left any exercises out that you like, feel free to leave your comments, or if you liked the video, like it, and please subscribe. I want to do a lot more content like this, and I don't want you to miss it. Other than that, thank you everyone. Good luck and take care.